If you want to join me, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 32. We are wrapping up this section of Genesis. We're going to start our series called Holy Union next week about marriage. We'll do that for about 6 weeks or so. We're actually going to come back to Genesis, and that will help sort of lead us right into Advent. So we have been looking at the life specifically here for the last several weeks of Jacob. And we started all the way back right in Genesis, and we began to look at the big stuff, creation and the fall and Noah and Tower of Babel. And that led us to the family and God's covenant with the family of Abraham and the promises that he had made to them, that there would be descendants like the stars, that out of that there would come one, the anointed one, the one we know as the Messiah, who would be the one who would bring peace and hope and joy back and restore the things that had been lost and broken. And that we've seen how in each of the generations there has been an individual. It was started with Abraham, and then it was Isaac, and now we're to Jacob. And we've seen how God has been moving and working through this family. And in each generation there's been this one son who has been designated that it was through his line. And we talked last week even how Judah, one of those sons, the next son, is going to be that line of promise. And we'll see that more when we come back to this. But we're gonna sort of close our time where we're specifically about Jacob this morning here in chapter 32. If you'll join me, we're just going to read 22 through 32. We're going to talk a little bit about the first beginning stuff, but we're going to read together 22 through 32. The same night, this is Jacob, arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, his 11 children, and he crossed the ford of the Jabbok. And he took them and he sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. And when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket. And Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And then he said, "Let me go, for the day is broken." That was the man that he was wrestling said, "Let me go, for the day is broken." Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." And then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And then he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel and said, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." And the sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because it touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. Now, let's talk about what this means. I want to do a little reminder, because some of us are visiting with us. Some of us maybe were not here a few weeks ago when we began kind of this journey of Jacob out of the house of his dad, right? He was going to look for a wife. And there was a moment as we were looking at that when we talked about how it got dark. And Jacob, like the sun was descending, and Jacob had no place to lay his head. That's why he put his head on the rock. He had nothing. He had no one. He was all by himself. And as we come sort of to the close of this is sort of the bookend of that story, because here we find Jacob again. And he has sent everybody on ahead. He is all by himself. He has no one. And he is going to wrestle. We're going to find out here in a moment that it is God. He's going to wrestle God until what? Until the sun rises. And so there's sort of this picture, this literary picture of the sun setting and darkness, and Jacob having to face the darkness. And now here he is wrestling with God to the point of blessing until the light rises at the end kind of our story. We have also talked about kind of throughout this how the Bible, and in particular these Old Testament narratives, are very much a contrast to what we expect, maybe what some of us have even been told the Bible is. See, what we get told and sort of what people expect is that the Bible is this book of moral tales. That there are these heroes that are put in these hard places and they make wise choices, and when they do the right thing, they get good stuff. And if we would just be like them, then everything would turn out well for us. And that is, especially in the story of Jacob, not true. Jacob's not a nice guy. Jacob is a manipulator and a schemer and a conniver. He's a trickster. He is the wrestler, as it were. That's what his name means. He has been wrestling, striving, fighting, bargaining, everything to get what he thought he needed and deserved and wanted. And he is in no way, right, the model for how we should be behaving. Because the Bible isn't really ultimately about how to live a good life. That's not what it's about. The Bible is instead, I believe, about how we meet God. The God whose grace we need. It's the revelation that we are a lost and broken people with a God who has pursued us to the point of his son's death because we were in so much need. And we see here as clearly as anywhere else, right? Because Jacob keeps screwing things up. He keeps messing it up. He keeps doing the wrong thing. He keeps going the wrong direction. He keeps asking the wrong question even. But this morning, we're going to look at Jacob's moment, the moment of his change and transformation, his life-altering encounter with God, his moment of grace. And I think, right, I want you to be asking yourself, how do I get this moment? If this is Jacob's moment, when he has finally sort of gotten to the spot where he's come to the bottom and he's wrestled with God, to the point where he has encountered him in grace, how do I have that moment? What are the necessary sort of aspects of it? I think there are 4. We're going to look at them hopefully quickly this morning. One of them is that we have to meet God ourselves. It's an individual process. We have to meet God ourselves in our weakness, not our strength. We have to meet God in what I'm calling the middle, and I'll talk more about that here in just a second. And lastly, we have to meet God. Here's the controversial statement for the day. We have to meet God in his weakness. Save the controversy for the end. Let's meet God ourselves. Verse 24. Here's what's happening, right? Jacob has been in the land of his forefathers. He has worked for 14 years. He's now got multiple wives and a bunch of kids, and he has been very successful. The things that he's put his hands to, right? The flocks have multiplied. He's got all of that stuff. And God comes to him here in the beginning of chapter 32 and says, I want you to go home. It's time. You are the son of promise. You are the one in the line. You need to go back to the land that I have promised your fathers. It's time. Do it. And the interesting thing for us here is that Jacob actually does it. Jacob gets up. Jacob gathers all of his people. He gets his wives and his kids and his flocks and his servants and all of the wealth that he has amassed, right? Remember, he left with nothing. And here he is returning almost in power with all of this stuff. And he's going, but he knows in the back of his mind the whole way what is waiting for him. Right, again, if you remember back to a couple weeks ago, when he left, his brother had threatened to kill him. His brother who has been in possession of his inheritance now, right? He's left it behind. And so the brother's in charge of the army, in essence. We're going to find out it's about 400 guys. He's been left in charge of that. And so Jacob knows that as he goes back, he is facing the reality of the consequences of the decisions that he had been making. So he's a little bit afraid. But we see the beginnings of transformation in Jacob is that he is even continuing. Right? He's returning home. He's got his family and his entourage and his wealth, but he gets word as he's heading home, right? The story has gotten to his brother. His brother is coming out to meet him. He's bringing 400 men. So Jacob is sure that Esau is bringing the 400 men to destroy him and his wealth and his family and his children. So ever the conniver and the trickster, Jacob comes up with a plan. Jacob starts sending small groups of people with gifts for his brother. And he sort of sends them in waves in hopes that he's going to sort of appease his brother. And by the end, right, when we open our story, he is on the side of a river. He knows that tomorrow is the day. There is no more, right? They've been coming towards each other like the two trains that we always had when we were in 6th grade math about what time were they going to meet. The time they were going to meet was tomorrow. And so Jacob, in one last motion, sends all of the rest, all of his stuff, the wives, the kids who he had saved towards the end. He has no idea. Have the gifts been received? Right? There's no cell phones, there's no email, there's no instant communication. He doesn't know. He just knows that Esau has been continuing towards him. And so finally, right, he's sort of coming to the end, and so he says, okay, everybody else go across. I'm going to spend this night alone praying. Again, this is a transformation. Even the night that we looked at a couple weeks ago when his head was on the rock and God showed him the stairway to heaven, he hadn't been praying. He hadn't been begging God. He hadn't been calling out to him. And yet now that's what we see him doing. He is praying. It's the last night. Tomorrow Esau is going to arrive. And so we see that as he encounters God, it is done personally. It's individually. There's a very real sense that our relationship with God is not based upon anybody else. Now that might sound odd, right? We're coming that on the heels. We just sat here and went, hey, we're the gospel rub. We need community. We need a church body. We need Sunday school teachers. We need community groups. And those things are true. These are not contradictory ideas. We just need both things. We need the reality of our own personal relationship with God that we see here in Jacob, and it needs to be encouraged, right? It needs to be salted and seasoned and sung together and experienced. But there's a danger. And the danger is that we can sort of enjoy the community experience, and we can sort of thrive and function inside of other people's relationships to God himself. And we can see their joy and hear their stories and watch their transformation and somehow think that that's sufficient. It isn't. We need to experience it for ourselves, just like Jacob. And so here he is encountering God personally, individually, alone. We do it ourselves. We don't hide in our parents' faith. Some of you know I was a youth pastor for better than a decade. And it was one of those conversations that I had regularly. This thing happens almost universally. As a teenager gets to be 15, 16, 17, 18 years old, sometimes it doesn't happen until they're 23, but almost always, a student reaches a spot where they start to ask themselves, do I believe what my mom and dad believe? These are not bad students. These are students who grew up in good homes, faithful, youth group attendance, all that kind of stuff. They come to a spot along the road where they go, do I believe the thing that my parents believe? And almost always, when there's a moment of rebellion, when there's sort of this turning, when some of that stuff sometimes happens in college, sometimes in high school, what is happening, it's a healthy thing. And as scary as it feels, and I say it to parents and have said it to them now for 20 plus years, you want this to happen. Because you want the transition for a student from I'm living in the middle of my parents' faith to my own. To I've acquired this for myself, and this is the spot where I'm going to stand and I'm going to rest all of my life here. And that's what we see happening in Jacob. And it's happening to him, right? It has to happen by himself. Doesn't matter what my mom believes or my grandma believes or my youth group friends do. Doesn't matter what Pastor Jerry believes. It's got to be, have I had a personal, intimate, individual encounter with God? There's a famous sermon. I love to listen to it almost every Easter. I pull it out and bring it up on YouTube. And it's this old black guy preaching, and he lists the attributes of God and the names of Jesus and all this stuff. And he keeps coming to the end, and sort of at every phrase goes, I wonder, do you know him? And that's the question for us this morning. I wonder, do you know him? Not do I know him? Not does the person next to you, not does the person who brought you here know him? But I wonder, do you know him? Because that's the question that Jacob was asking. We have to not just meet God individually, we have to meet him in our weakness. This is one of those, this can be an intimidating idea and a challenging concept. Because in most of the rest of our lives, in almost every other area of our life, we want to meet things in our strength. We want to meet things in our competencies. right? We go to work and we want to work in the areas where we're good, right? We work long enough, we go to school long enough, we find out what we're good at, and then we go, I'm going to just do that. I'm good with numbers, I'm going to handle this over here. I'm not good with my hands, I'm going to work at a desk. Or I'm really good with my hands and I hate the idea of sitting inside all day long. I'm going to be somebody who works outside. Like we find the thing that we're good at, that we love and that we celebrate, right? Where people keep telling us we're good at it, but that's not how we meet God. We don't meet God in our strength, we meet him in our weakness. Look at Jacob. For the first time, right, it feels like, because we keep saying it, Jacob's a screw up. It feels like he's sort of gotten it together. He's got these wives who at least kind of like him. He's got these kids who are kind of following along. He's been successful at acquiring the stuff and the flocks. He's been moving it all in the right direction. And he's going home. God has called him to obedience, and he's actually obeying. He doesn't turn around. He doesn't go back when he hears that Esau's coming. He's going, no, even at risk to my own life, at risk to all of this stuff that I love, I'm going to be obedient and I'm going to return back to the land of my father. He keeps moving forward. In chapter 31 and verse 2, God appears to Jacob and he tells him to go home, go back to the land of promise. And here he is, right? He is obeying at risk to himself. And so we see this Jacob who's sort of growing and maturing and, right, and obeying. And what do we expect if we're honest? Here's Jacob, and he seems to be, right, all of a sudden he's kind of come around a corner. He's like that 20-something who finally has their first apartment and a first job, and they're paying their bills, and stuff is moving forward, and you think, oh, good. God's going to bless him. Like, God's going to, and what happens? God shows up and wrestles him. God shows up and breaks him. God shows up and throws him to the ground in the moment when it looks like he is closest to being obedient. Because how do we expect God to respond to a guy who's not just sort of being obedient, but risking his very life for that obedience? What we don't expect, right, is what happens. We don't think that God is going to walk into the field and clobber him. We don't think that God's going to walk in and break him forever. And I hope this morning you are willing to ask yourself, do I have a right understanding of who God is in light of this story? Because this is like the culture's picture of God. The sort of that lovey, hippy-dippy, everybody gets in. God doesn't really care what anybody does. He's just love. Like he's everybody's big, like old grandma who just wants to bake them cookies when they show up. That's our culture's picture of God. Don't judge me. You don't have the right. Nobody can tell me what to do. Whatever makes me happy. God just wants me to be me. And if that's an armadillo, I get to be an armadillo. But it also, right, it's not that sort of what I think most of the people in this room would go, that sort of weird, sort of left-ended liberal picture of God. It's not just that that's wrong. It's not what for many of us is how we grew up in sort of conservative, traditional picture of God, which is if I do the right things, if I come to church enough times, if I write the right check, if I raise my kids in the right way, if I do my own personal quiet time devotions, it's all going to go okay for me. It's not that either. Because this is God. This is not our picture of God. This is him. He knocks people down. Some of us don't like this. He cripples them for life sometimes. Now, I want to say this to you, right? Because some of you your hackles are up a little bit. Who would make this up? Who would tell this story about God if you wanted people to believe in him? If you were trying to gather a group of people and go, I just want as many people who will come and do this. Who would tell this kind of a story about God? That's why I think it's true. That's why I think the Bible is true, because it reveals this sort of stuff to us over and over and over again about God. It is in no way the kind of God that we would create if we were creating him. C.S. Lewis, right? There's a famous quote in the midst of one of the Chronicle of Narnia's book. One of the kids is looking, they see Aslan the lion, and they say, is he safe? And the response is, safe? Who said anything about him being safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good and he's the king, I tell you. Hear me, friends. The Word of God in Hebrews chapter 4 says about itself that it is sharper than a double-edged sword, that it's able to divide truth and error. There's a sense in which it is a razor, and we've got to be very precise here. Because I think it's possible on both of these sides to wind ourselves into error. And I think we want to be really careful that we're slicing right in the right spot. In John chapter 11, let's just tell a story that I think gives us the right spot. In John chapter 11, Jesus is away from his friend whose name is Lazarus. He gets word that his friend Lazarus is sick, and his family wants Jesus to come that he might heal him. Jesus delays. On his way there, Jesus gets word that his friend Lazarus is dead. And so as Jesus arrives at the tomb, we might, right? There would be a sense on one side where we could expect Jesus to sort of go, why are you guys, don't you know? Like, are you guys just stupid? I am all power. I can do whatever I want to do. I'm going to raise him from dead here in just a moment. You guys are weeping for nothing. You're foolish. But instead, what does he do? He mourns with them. He's angry at the realities and the consequences of sin and death and destruction and the sorrow of it. And it says that he himself weeps. He's not just clinical in the midst of the suffering. He doesn't just go, here's the lesson, suck it up. Here's the academic thing, here's the bullet points. Why don't you just know this about me? He isn't some remote, weird God. He's in it. He's in the middle of it. He's suffering with us. He weeps with those who weep. But catch this. Note takers, this is the one you want to write down. God has to wrestle us into transformed lives. God has to wrestle us into transformed lives rather than comfort us into transformed lives. God doesn't comfort people into transformation. He wrestles them into transformation. See, I think if you look at verse 28, that's Jacob's moment. Then he, the person we now believe is Jesus, looks at him and says, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven, you have wrestled with God and with men, and you have prevailed. The wrestler says to him, you have wrestled with God and you have prevailed. You, Jacob, whose name means wrestling, have wrestled. You've Jacobed with God. See, I don't think until this moment Jacob actually knew who he was wrestling. It was dark, right? The sun hasn't risen. That's what the story tells us. He couldn't see who he was wrestling. So he's been wrestling sort of for all that he's worth. But in that moment, Jesus speaks and goes, you have been wrestling God. You have been wrestling me. Now see, Jacob knew all of the stories. There was no Netflix, right? It wasn't like when the sun went down, the family gathered around a little glowing box and nobody spoke to one another anymore. What they did was sit around the fire and tell each other stories. And so Jacob had his whole life been hearing the stories that we've been telling ourselves over these last weeks, right? Stories of Abraham and Sarah and Jesus walking out of the wilderness and sitting at tents and Sarah's inside the tent and she's laughing, and that's why his dad's name is Isaac, and all, like, he's heard all of these interactions and encounters with God. The visions and the dreams and the promises and the covenants. He's heard all of these stories. And in verse 28, what he finds out is that he's having his own moment. And while he's wrestling, think back in verse number 25, right? Because it's going to put what happens in 25 into context once he realizes who it is that he's been wrestling. Because in 25, when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, Jacob is wrestling Jesus. Now, this is a fascinating statement. We're going to talk about it here in just a minute. But essentially, this says to us, when Jesus saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. So there comes a moment when Jesus is wrestling with Jacob, goes, I'm not prevailing against him, and he touches his hip, and his hip is out of socket. Now, the text says to us that this is just a touch, right? This was not some forceful blow. He didn't get a hatchet and smack him with it. This is literally all it required. Jacob would have, in that moment, recognized what? That the person that he was wrestling with at any moment could have done that very thing. The person who could touch him with their finger and his hip be put out of joint has been wrestling him all along and at any moment could have destroyed him. The awareness of this, in that moment, the awesomeness of the one that he is wrestling. He stops wrestling and in the way that he had been wrestling, and it changes. See, think about what, if you're laying there in the dark, you're prepared, you think someone is across the river, your brother is on his way to destroy you, he's got 400 men, they want you dead, and in the dark of that night, someone grabs a hold of you, what are you doing? You're trying to get away. What you want to do is get as far away from this person who wants to harm me as possible. The wrestling was for escape. Until he recognizes the person that I'm wrestling isn't one of those guys. This is God himself, the all-powerful one. And then it says what? Now he won't let go. Now he no longer wants to escape and get away. Now he's going, I'm going to hang on with all that's in me because I cannot and will not let go. Before he was wrestling to win. But now that he knows who this is, he's saying, I want you in my life. There is no other place. Jacob has tried all of the other stuff. Jacob has had wealth, lost wealth, acquired wealth. Jacob thought that the love of the most beautiful woman that he'd ever seen would be sufficient. She wasn't. He thought, right, if I just get some kids and some, right, they're not. He has tried sort of all the stuff, even the stuff that most of us have been told will be enough. And he's at the moment where in recognizing that he says, the only thing that counts is God himself. And God has shown up, right? Because this is the God who has shown up wrestling to bless him. And in the moment of Jacob's greatest weakness, his hip is out. He's got a leg that doesn't work. Some of you have heard me tell this story before. When I was 2 or 3 years old, my parents had a folding table, like one of the old school church folding tables. Now we have those fun plastic ones that one guy can carry with one hand, and so he can carry multiple. The old ones that it took like 4 grown men to carry because they had metal banding, and it was like, they weighed 800 pounds. One of those was leaning up in our living room because we had had a family party. And I, being small, tried to climb it, and it fell over and cracked me across both of my hips. I ended up in traction for 6 weeks because the fractures took place right where the ball and the socket, anyway, right there. I can tell you, I'm like a 75-year-old guy. From the time that I was 3, I could tell you when it was going to rain. I'm that guy. And some of you have heard the story, like there was a time when I was in high school when Meg was deciding whether or not she thought that I was the guy that she might be interested in, and I would walk across the gym floor. I have my left leg drags a little bit because I've got 2 bad hips. I walk with a limp. She thought that I had this really cool, little pimp walk, and the reality is I'm just broken and maimed. So as a guy who can feel that, right, in those moments, and as I'm aging, right, I'm at 45 these days, and some days that feels more like 45 than it used to. I know I'm not 25 anymore. 45. I can feel, like you start to feel your age in your hip, and mine are still attached. And here's Jacob, right, and God has simply touched him, and in that moment of weakness, and is most desperate, in his most desperate moment, he says, I'm going to hold on to you, God. There isn't any place else for me to go. There isn't any place else that has an answer, because I've tried all of the other stuff. See, I've known this is true in my life. God wrestles us. He wrestles us to transformation. I know some of the stories in this room well enough to know he wrestles you into transformation. I don't think I know anybody who has been comforted into transformation. It's not how it works. This is the God who shows up and says, I want to bless you. I want to change your life. I want you to know who I'm calling you to be, Jacob. Who I've created you uniquely to be and how to function. But in order for that to happen, in order for you to be changed and transformed and called into the person that I'm calling you to be, you have to first see that you're stupid. You have to first see that you're foolish. You have to first see that your past has been one of darkness and brokenness. Because you will not let yourself be transformed, right? You keep stopping it. You keep hunting all of the other things. God in his love for us, is an enemy of our old selves. That's why he has to wrestle it and break it. Because the old self is the thing that is condemning us to death. It's condemning us to heartache and brokenness. But God in his love for us is calling us, bringing us, transforming us into the life of promise. And he has to bring us, he has to show us our weakness to wake us up to it. He also meets us in the middle. Jacob's life has converged here, right? I mean, this is one of those stories where we've seen Jacob and he's been through the mill. And this man, Jesus, comes and wrestles him. It says that he comes and Jacobs him. He Jacobs with Jacob. The wrestler gets wrestled. And he gets out-wrestled. He gets out-Jacobed. The thing that Jacob thought he was. The thing that Jacob would have believed about his own identity. That the way he got to where he was by being Jacob. And God out-Jacobs him. His whole life has been a wrestle. From the womb to his birth, to his birthright, to the blessing, right? Over and over and over. We see him. He's tricking, he's conniving, he's manipulating. He's all of that stuff he thinks he's doing to accomplish what he thinks he needs to be accomplishing. He's been jockeying for position and love and blessing. Who does he think that he's been wrestling this whole time? Right, we know that Jacob has tricked and connived. He tricked and connived his dad. He wrestled and lost to Laban. But the person, right, who's on the other side of the river that he thinks he's been wrestling his whole life is his twin brother. From the moment that he was in the womb to coming out of the womb, right, to the birthright and the thing, this guy's going to kill me. Now this guy's bringing this army. He's convinced that the bane of his existence, the thing that's going to frustrate and thwart what he believes that he needs and wants is Esau. And he thinks that tomorrow is his big day. He thinks that this night he's going to sort of gather his strength. He's going to pray himself up. He's going to ask God to help him. And tomorrow he's going to go face his giant. And God walks into the field. And Jesus grabs a hold of him and says, "You're a fool. You're not wrestling Esau. You've never been wrestling Esau. You didn't wrestle your dad. You weren't wrestling Laban. You're not wrestling them. You've been wrestling me." And in the middle of it, smack dab, right here in the middle of his life, this mysterious figure comes and says, tomorrow isn't the climax of your life. It's not some future day. It's right now. It's right now in this moment. The thing that sits underneath all of the other things, all of the other wrestles, all of the other desire for blessing, all of the problem that has sat underneath all of the other problems. You've been resisting God. You've been fighting me and arguing with me and not being who I'm calling you to be. You've been trying to wrestle and flee from me. You've been trying to save yourself. Jesus was saying, I'm the center. I'm the middle. I'm the thing that all of the other things are revolving around. I'm the center of mass that gravity is drawing you to. I'm the one that's been here all along, and you will not understand yourself, your life, the things that are taking place in it, why they're taking place, until you get this. Until you have this encounter with me. See, Jacob has been wrestling his whole life. It's his name. He's the wrestler. He's the conniver and the manipulator. But he's also the one who has been seeking and searching and longing for blessing. And here in this moment, with his hip out, he grabs a hold and says, I'm not letting go until you bless me. He figures it out. You're the only one. Jacob's life has been marked by the search for blessing. We looked a couple weeks ago, right? He grew up and he lacked it. He longed for his dad to bless him. He longed for his dad to see him and recognize him and love him and look at him the way that he looked at his brother, and he never got it. It's what he's been looking for. And so he's been out there, right? He's been wrestling anybody and everybody for this blessing, trying to find his role and his identity and his worth. He's been wanting someone to give him glory, to give weight to his life. He's tricked his dad. He'd worked 14 years for his beautiful wife, Rachel, right? He's done all of this stuff over and over and over again. And even his experiences, his moments with God that have led him to this place, even as he laid there and he saw the stairway to heaven, he comes out of that and he says to God, all right, I'll be obedient, but only if you do this. And he's been trying, right, to get God to come to his sort of argument, to fight him on his grounds. And Jesus has walked in and gone, you've been missing it all along. And in this moment of exhaustion and pain, he goes from being someone who has known about God, who's heard stories about God, to someone who is experiencing him for himself. Jacob in this moment is going, I've been the idiot. I've been the fool. I've been the one who hasn't gotten this. Your approval, your love, your glory, this is what I've been looking for all along. You are the beauty and the blessing that I've been seeking. We can tell that this is when the transformation happens because it's the same way we can tell when it happens in us. See, when we stop looking for, longing for, hoping for, manipulating for God to give me the thing that I think I need in order for me to feel blessed, and instead go, what I need, God, is you. All I want is you, your approval, your beauty, your riches, your inheritance, your friendship. Can I speak it even more plainly? See, I think the biggest sign that Jacob is holding on, the biggest sign that this is Jacob's moment of transformation, is that even in the midst of the pain, he's holding on. Even and in spite of the danger of what is to come, in spite of the fact that the same guy who just touched his hip and exploded it, right, made him walk with a limp for the rest of his life, that same guy is still a hold of him. Any moment he could touch him. In fact, I think it gets even more dangerous. See, once he figures out that this is God, and he sees that, right, the time is coming that the sun would rise, we see in some other spots and in ongoing ways in the Old Testament that we can't see the face of God without being undone. You couldn't see the full glory, the weight of him, see his face without being undone. And so I think what's happened is, here's Jacob, he's been wrestling in the dark with the God of the universe, and he sees the sun coming up, and the danger is that the sun's going to come up, and then he'll be able to see the face of Jesus, and it will destroy him. But he's willing to risk even that for the blessing. He so wants God himself. So Jesus says to Jacob, let me go. The sun's coming up. It's almost dawn. And when the sun comes up, you're going to see my face. It's going to destroy you. Jacob's going, I'm willing to risk my own destruction. Without your blessing, without your love, without you, I don't have anything worth having. Because I've already tried everything else. I sent it on ahead because it wasn't going to sustain me in this moment. Family, wealth, women, kids, all of it. I can't go anybody else. There isn't any place else. There isn't anything else that I can seek that's going to give me the blessing except for you alone, God. These things can't, don't, won't satisfy me. And I won't let go until I have your blessing. See, so often when we come to God, what we come saying is, I need this thing. I've got this broken relationship, and God, if you will just fix this relationship so that I can feel blessed. God, I need this job. I don't have enough money. I can't research. I can't pay for this. If you will just give me this other thing, we keep coming to him going, and it's like we're wrestling him for something outside of himself. And we're saying to him, I know what I need. Give it to me. I'm in love. I'm in lust. I'm in want, right? I'm in need. I need satisfied. I need accomplishment. I need relationship. And we're saying to him over and over and over again, I know what the center of my life is. Here it is. Without this, I'm not happy. Without this, I'm not fulfilled. Without this, I'm nothing. And God's going, the thing that needs to sit in the middle, the thing that needs to sit in the center is me. He says, I don't work like that. I don't operate just on the edges and the fringes of your life. I'm not your co-pilot. I'm not interested in being the thing that you sort of show up when you're in desperation to get that other thing. Look at verses 28 through 30 again. Then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and you have prevailed. I'm going to tell you, that's maybe the hardest sentence in the whole section. You've striven, you've wrestled with God and men, and you won. And we go, what? God just looked at him and said, you've been fighting me and everybody else. You've been manipulating and conniving. You're a terrible person, so I'm going to reward you. In this moment, broken, holding on for dear life, and God looks at him and says, okay, you're the winner. You win. You're the prevailer. How can God do this? Jacob has not been a nice guy. Jacob has been extremely selfish, conniving, manipulative. His dad, mom, brother, wives, how can he be a winner? How can that be the conclusion of the story? In verse 30, Jacob says something. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. See, Jacob is going, I've wrestled face to face with God himself, and I wasn't destroyed. I deserved to be destroyed. What I'd earned was destruction. What I earned was losing. But I was a winner. Jacob is amazed. He knows that he deserves the destruction and defeat and death. He knows that he isn't morally qualified. He knows that he knows that his past is full of darkness and death. He knows all of that stuff, and yet God has gone, you get to win. You get the blessing. Here's the fourth thing. We have to meet God in his weakness. See, verse 25, if you go back to verse 25, there's a conundrum in the middle of this. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. The man, one of the other translations says that the man saw that he couldn't overpower him. And when you first read that story, it's not a problem. And then you realize that it's Jesus. It's God himself that he's wrestling against. And what do we know? At any point, what should have been able to happen? Jesus should have been able to prevail. Some of you guys know, I wrestled in high school. I was 13, 14 in middle school when I started, and my dad was about my size. Big guy, country strong. I couldn't, when my dad didn't want me to move him, I couldn't move him. But every once in a while, when we would wrestle, my dad would let me win a little bit. And now as the dad of 5 kids and 4 boys, they like to wrestle me. The 2 little ones like to sort of tag up together because they think that that's going to be enough. And when I want to, right, I can grab a hold of them because I'm what I am, and I can grab a hold of all four of their hands and hold them still and pick them up in the air and move them and do what I want to do. They can't stop me. But sometimes I let them win for a little bit. Just a moment. They're testing themselves, right? They're trying, and so I give them that moment. What do I have to do in order for them to win? I have to withhold my power. I have to take my weight and bring it out. I can't bring all of me sort of into the fight. And that's what I think is happening here. Jesus brings his weakness to this, or Jacob would have never survived. See, in the moment that he touches his hip, we get the key. In terms of absolute power, God possesses it. He never didn't have it. This was always the possibility. At any moment, Jesus could have reached any of the joints and gone, "You're done." But he doesn't use all of his weight, all of his power. He makes himself weak. Why? Because incinerating Jacob wasn't the point. Because he's accomplishing something with intention and purpose. He wanted his changed heart. And so he lost, right? He lets him win. This is a confusing sentence, so I'm going to read it. If he had won, Jesus had won, he would have lost the thing that he wanted. I'll say that to you again. If he won, he would have lost the very thing that he wanted. He won. Jesus won in losing. And this isn't just some cute paradox. It's the gospel that we want to rub on one another. It's the one we want to rub on all of the kids. It's the one we want to soak down in us and transform us. On the cross, in that moment, God won by losing. He triumphed in defeat. See, everybody else that looked at the cross thought that Jesus had lost. He was dead. He was bloody. He had been mocked and beaten and shamed and abandoned by all his friends, and to all appearances, he had lost. But in that moment, he won everything. In that moment, everything was changed and transformed. He won by losing. See, because in that moment, Jesus took the weight of the Father. The weight that would have crushed Jacob, the weight that would have crushed you and I in our sinfulness, in our darkness and our brokenness. And instead, he crushed Jesus. And in losing, Jesus won for us. That we might have hope, that we might have an eternity, that we might have lives of promise. Jesus took the curse of the law, the curse of failed obedience. He took the devastating, destroying blow of justice so that we might get the beautiful benefit of love. And so what we do is we come now in our weakness going, I can't do this, I can't accomplish this. We, like Jacob, come to those moments and say, I've tried, and none of the other things are satisfying. But you, and Father, I'm going to cling to you and you alone. And when we come in our weakness, he meets us in his, that we might have new life, that we might have hope and future and promise. And so, friends, this morning I invite you into a life of glorious gospel rub. Let that soak in, let that permeate and penetrate and transform us, that we might be those who can give it away, that we might be those who walk with a limp. See, it's an interesting thing. Jacob walks for the rest of his life with a limp. And at every moment, right, whether it was a son or a grandson or a friend or somebody else, right, when they're sitting around the fire, not watching the glowing box, and they start to tell stories, and somebody would inevitably say to him, "Tell us how that happened." And what would he start to tell? The story of his moment, the moment when God met him in his weakness, the moment when he transformed him. And friends, so often what we've been told is we need to go in our strength. We need to go in our power. We need to go in our intellect. We go in our weakness. We go in the reality that what we brought to the table was our lostness, and what he brought to the table was power in the cross. Let's pray this morning. Father, we come. For some of us, our whole lives have been lived in strength. We've tried to put on the right face. We've tried to do the right thing. We've tried to say the right thing. And we fail. We fall short of the glory, your word says. And the consequence of that falling short, your word also says that the wages of that, the reality of that is death. It's lostness and brokenness. But that your gift to us in our weakness is eternal life. And so, Father, I invite anybody in the room who's never experienced that to experience it. That they in this moment would admit their need. They would admit their desperate attempts. That they would see you for who you are as the one who has come. That they would believe that Jesus was the one who went to the cross on their behalf. And that, Father, in this moment they would cry out that you would be their Redeemer and Savior. And Father, for some of us who have known that, lived that, experienced that for weeks, months, years, decades, some of us, may we stop trying to go back to those things. May we stop putting something else in the middle. But Father, instead, may we live out of the reality of the gospel that you have loved us exactly as we are, and that you are changing us and transforming us in our weakness into your strength, into your power, and that our identity and our glory, our weight is yours and not ours. We pray these things in the great name of Jesus. Amen.